O'Malley Taught Me Sunday, I'm sorry. Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today O'Malley Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman O'Malley Yesatella. My name is Tiffany, and I am a member of the African People's Socialist Party, and I will be your MC this morning. Today's study, we are continuing a special series where Chairman takes us through each chapter of the political report to the 7th Congress, which is just around the corner. This week, the Chairman will be reading Part 1 of Chapter 10, titled The African Nation. This chapter may appear familiar. That's because it can be found in Chairman's book, In Uneasy, Equilibrium. The question of African nation is always so important and so relevant, no matter what's happening in the world. In this chapter, Chairman is going to lay out why we as black people in the U.S. or Jamaica or Brazil or anywhere we have been dispersed call ourselves one African people. This chapter also details the importance of consolidating the African nation and why this is so critical in advancing the struggle for total liberation of Africa and African people. Chairman will read the first half of Chapter 10, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers, where you will have an opportunity to comment and ask questions pertaining to this chapter specifically. We ask you to write your questions as you think of them so that we are able to take them following the reading. We also encourage that when you comment your questions, you state your location for us so we can see where everyone is watching from. It is now my honor to introduce the the leader of the African nation himself, Chairman O'Malley Yesatella.
Uhuru, imperialist political oracle and Obama advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski is a ruling class observer of the crisis of imperialism. In his book, Second Chance, Three Presidents and the Crisis of a Superpower, Brzezinski makes this observation about the significance of the question of identity today, when imperialism is being challenged to its parasitic foundation by the political intervention of the peoples upon whose oppression this system was founded. And we quote Brzezinski here: global systemic instability is likely to be prompted in many parts of the world by challenges to existing state frontiers. Frontiers, borders, is what effectively they're talking about here. In Asia and Africa especially, state borders are often imperial legacies and do not reflect ethnic or linguistic boundaries. These borders are vulnerable to increased pressure as heightened political consciousness leads to more assertive territorial aspirations. The largely anti-Western character of populist activism has less to do with ideological or religious bias and more with historical experience. Western or European domination is part of the living memory of hundreds of millions of Asians and Africans and some Latin Americans, though in this case its sharp edge is pointed at the United States. In the vast majority of states, national identity and national emancipation are associated with the end of foreign imperial domination. This is true in such large and self-confident states as India or China as it is in Congo or Haiti, unquote. In addition to Brzezinski's consideration of the question, there is a bevy of other publications attempting to address the same issue of the nation and identity. They include David Canadine's 2013 book, The Undivided Past, Humanity Beyond Our Differences, and the 2004 Samuel Huntington book entitled Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. Patrick Buchanan's Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive to 2025, is another of the intellectual forays into the arena of the nation and its future from the vantage point of various representatives of U.S. and or European imperialism. These far-seeing, thinking representatives of the white ruling class are being forced to contend with the earth-shattering consequences of a European civilization resting on the historical fault line of economic parasitism. The shifting center of gravity in the world, the omnipresent upsurge of the wretched of the earth to realize the dreams of happiness and security comes at the expense of imperialist stability. The resistance of the oppressed unhinges the previous definitions of social reality that required imperialist imposed tranquility for its foundation and raises the question of the nation and identity to central stage. I think that just to point out, because we are speaking essentially to the African working class, there are some people to whom what we say, the names that we reference here, are recognizable. But for most of us in the African working class, we haven't the slightest idea who the hell Huntington and we will mention Fukuyama and Buchanan and a lot of these people are. But it's really important for us to understand is that when we talk about Brzezinski being this oracle, we have to recognize that most of these guys get elected into political office. They aren't necessarily that bright. There is a cadre. There are a cadre of forces out there who put forth these ideas that define the world, and that's what we say they are the far-seeing, thinking representatives of white power. They are the thinking representatives of the ruling class. I mean, George Bush, for example, people used to compare his intellect with a brick. And then, you've got Trump, who everyday people can see, that Trump is not the most profound intellectual that you can find any place. And, Ronald Reagan, suffered obvious dementia from the beginning of his presidency. So the point is that these guys are not necessarily that bright, but they have cadre, they have schools who pump these guys out, and they are the far-seeing, thinking representatives of white power. And I'm mentioning this because we have to have African working class intellectuals, and that's what we are becoming in the process of these studies and discussions that we're always involved in, except our perspective when we are successful is always different from the perspective of the imperial colonial capitalist ruling class. Because theirs is the perspective of the oppressor and the exploiter, and ours is the perspective of those being exploited and oppressed. And it's only when we are unsuccessful that the bourgeoisie or the ruling class or the colonial capitalist ruling class has control of our brains. And when we speak, when we open our mouths, they speak through our mouths. We run into these people every day who shouldn't be thinking the way they think, who shouldn't be saying what they say, because their objective interests, their material interests are profoundly different from the interests of the ruling class. That you shouldn't be thinking this. Your interests are entirely different from the ruling class. But we think this because the ruling class has captured our brains. So we open our mouth, and it's not us speaking through of our own interests, it's the bourgeoisie that's speaking through us. So we have to have actually working class intellectuals. That's what we're in the process of carving and creating, and that's why we go through all these studies and discussions all the time. We have to smash this notion in our own ranks of our inability to understand what appears to be these complex questions and things like that, and thereby we accede to our enemies and our oppressors the right to think for us. And those days are over. That's what this party, this class, this Congress, this political report is all about. So we say, I'm going to start again at the paragraph that I've read. The shifting center of gravity in the world, the omnipresent upsurge of the wretched of the earth to realize our dreams of happiness and security comes at the expense of imperialist stability. It comes at the expense of imperialist stability. Our struggle to just get what is rightfully ours, to be able to stand up as human beings, to recapture the value of our own labor, to recapture our own dignity, to recapture our own identity as a people, it shakes, it acts like an earthquake in terms of the existing social system and the stability of the imperialism. The resistance of the oppressed unhinges the previous definitions of social reality that required imperialist imposed tranquility for its foundation and raises the question of the nation and identity to center stage. Just think about that. As long as we can be convinced that we are African Americans or some kind of Americans, it's cool. At the moment Africans begin to say that we are African people, that we are a distinct people, and we are not immigrants but captives in this country, then the entire imperialist system is shaken by that. And the masses of Africans and masses of Mexicans and masses of people who they call American Indians and all these other hyphenated hybrid type identities begin to stand up on our own feet. The thing can't stand. The imperialist foundation is shattered forever. In his 2007 book, Day of Reckoning, How Hubris, Ideology, and Greed Are Tearing America Apart, Patrick Buchanan probes the question of the nation. And we quote Buchanan here. Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, it is said, were artificial nations created by the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain in 1919. Those are the treaties that ended the First Imperialist War. And the Soviet Union was but the Russian Empire reconstructed by the Red Army. The Red Army was the Soviet military power. The KGB, the Communist Party, and Leninist ideology, not a nation at all. The sudden disintegration of these three nations into 26 seemed to substantiate Strobe Talbot's prediction in his 1992 Time essay, The Birth of the Global Nation. And here he quotes Strobe Talbot. All countries are basically social arrangements, accommodations to changing circumstances. No matter how permanent or even sacred they may seem at any one time, in fact, they are all artificial and temporary. Within the next 100 years, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. A phrase briefly fashionable in the mid-20th century, citizen of the world, will have assumed real meaning by the end of the 21st century. And he's quoting Talbot here, unquote. Is the time of nations over, says Buchanan? Is the nation state passing away? Are the bonds that hold them together so flimsy? Since Talbot's essays, events have not contradicted him, unquote. So this is a fear that they have, the disappearance of nations. This is their fear. But when they say nations, it's like when they say people, they mean white. And when they say nation, they mean white. Well, the disappearance of nations. So Buchanan's, and this has been a historical contradiction we've had to deal with. The people who control the world see themselves as the center of gravity and the world. When they say the people, they mean the white people. When they say the West, they mean the white people. When they say, this is what they are referencing here, notwithstanding all the other fluffiness that may surround the question. Buchanan's summation is representative of the anxiety of the international white ruling class, whose concerns about defending their world hegemony are reflected in the drone bombings, assassinations, unrelenting war, and threats of war. The current policies of the imperialists designed to crush the will of the people's resistance in Afghanistan and the Middle East, all of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the world are attempts to maintain the shaky empire and its ideological reflections that define identity and the nation according to its interests and will. Our entry into this discussion of the nation is mandated by the seriousness of the times. It is mandated by the requirement of Africans and the oppressed to provide a summation of reality that reflects our interests and our aspirations. Our summation is based on science and objective analysis grounded in material reality that predicts the defeat of imperialism and the emancipation of the toiling masses of Africa and the world. Our discussion of the nation is informed by our inevitable elevation as workers to the role of the ruling class in the transition to a world shorn of classes, borders, nations, and states. To win our liberation, we must know who we are and who our enemies are. Let us begin. Most often, the question of African nationality is handled in careless, offhanded, and vague ways, making no pretense of ascribing to any particular scientific approach or definition. The common practice among Pan-Africanists of referring to the international African community as African peoples is an example. More commonly, there is the practice of characterizing Africans forcibly dispersed from the continent as African, quote-unquote, descendants, with the intent of differentiating the African identity of such Africans from those who suffered imperial white domination on the continent itself. Africans are not unusual in the ambiguous manner in which the question of the nation is handled. In the past few centuries, there has been much debate concerning this issue among some of Europe's most erudite intellectuals. Their approach is equivalent to the quote, "I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like." Similarly, it is difficult to get a uniform definition of the nation from different scholars or intellectuals. Some claim outright that there is not an a priori definition of the nation. That is to say, something that you can define before. A quote, "I can't tell you what it is," they might say, "but I know it when I see it." That's what we mean by a priori. They say there is no a priori. You can't define it until it actually happens or you actually see it. Similarly, it is difficult to get a uniform definition of the nation from different scholars or intellectuals. Some claim outright that there is not an a priori definition of the nation, etc. "I can't tell you what it is," they might say, "but I know it when I see it." What is probably the most influential definition of the nation is one offered by Joseph Stalin. This is because, as leader of the Soviet Union and the international communist movement from 1924 to 1953, Stalin took the question out of the classrooms and into the fray of political movements throughout the world. Stalin applied his interpretation to the real conditions impacting and tormenting millions of people struggling to define their places in the world. Written at the end of 1912 or early in 1913, Stalin's position, later published in pamphlet form, defined the nation's key elements, which, according to Stalin, included a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. That's Stalin's definition of the nation. It includes, again, a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture, unquote. Obviously, the situation for Africans does not satisfy Stalin's definition of the nation, whether applied to the artificially created African so-called countries carved out at the Imperialist Berlin Conference in 1884 and 85, or to African people forcibly dispersed around the globe. While Stalin's definition of the nation is one of many, it contains within it elements being offered by others at the same time and even today. In fact, Stalin's definition was a struggle against contending definitions forwarded by European socialists at a time when nationalist sentiments were roiling in Europe. These ideas would soon facilitate the European bourgeois war to redivide the world, the First Imperialist World War or World War I. In his book, The Undivided Past, referred to above, author David Cannadine challenges many of the prevalent ideas around which the definition of the nation revolves. Here he deals with the requirements that makes language a prerequisite. While not addressing Stalin specifically, Cannadine had this to say about the self-defined European nations, quote unquote, involved in the First Imperialist World War. And here we quote Canada. This is interesting. To begin with, the idea that the belligerents of 1914, that is to say, those who participated in the First Imperialist World War, were a unified, homogeneous nation does not survive detailed examination. Consider, for example, the matter of common language, often regarded as essential to any shared sense of national identity. It certainly did not exist in the nation created by the Risorgimento. We have made Italy, Massimo Zeglio observed at the time, now we have to make Italians. We have made Italy. This is what he said. Now we have to make Italians, okay? Unquote. With less than 5% of the population using Italian for everyday purposes, they had a long way to go. In France, almost half the school children engaged with French as a foreign language. This is in 1914. Speaking another tongue at home. Dialect and patois were widespread, and in departments bordering other nations, it was often Flemish, Catalan, or German that was spoken. A similar picture could be found in Germany, where in the East many spoke Polish as their first language, whereas in Alsace and Lorraine many spoke French, and in Russia educated people conversed in French, while workers and peasants used a wide variety of Slavic languages and dialects. In Austria-Hungary, the array of different tongues was even more varied, including German, Czech, Italian, Hungarian, Polish, Croatian, and Greek. And many of the Habsburg emperor's subjects were multilingual, speaking one language at school or at work and another at home. Insofar as a common tongue could be considered an essential criterion, none of the major powers that went to war in 1914 qualified as a nation. The reason this is significant is because these are the people who define to us what the nation is. The Italians, the Germans, the French, the so-called Americans, they're the ones who define what a nation is, and they have defined us out of a national identity, you see. Yeah. And so they can impose this criterion of a nation on us while they didn't even meet the criterion themselves historically. And I just think it's important because people treat some of these questions as biblical, when the reality is that every force that's defining reality defines reality from, if it has the power to do so, defines the reality from its own interest, from the perspective of its own perceived interest. And Africans can do no less. This is not some innocent discussion we're having on nationhood, do you see? Right, and it's never like that in the real world. So you read it in the book, and therefore it's true. Canada challenges other ideas generally used to determine the nation, some of which also dispute Stalin's influential definition. We know many of the limitations of Stalin's work from our own observations. However, this does not relieve us of the need to enter into this discussion. It is true that nations exist, if only because the nation is a commonly held idea along the lines of Marx's maxim that theory, when grasped by the masses, become a material force. Indeed, the idea of the nation is something that has been grasped by the masses to the extent that people actually kill and die in the name of furthering its perceived interests. One of the least discussed questions concerning the nation is the basis for its advent in history. How is it that the world is perceived as a place where for thousands of years there was no such thing as the nation, only to have it suddenly emerge in Europe, dominating the 19th century, often referred to as the era of nation building? How is it? The world exists for 1,000 years, and the nation only emerges in Europe in the 19th century. And there are some other things that happens in the 19th century in Europe, of course, that offers an explanation for that. One attempt at an explanation for the advent of the European nation is provided by Modibo M. Kadali, PhD, in his book published in 2000 entitled Internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and the Struggle of Social Classes. This rather lengthy and vacuous quote illustrates the general lack of clarity that surrounds this issue. I know, by the way, Comrade Modibo. We worked with him in Atlanta many years ago. And so we quote Modibo here now. It's a long quote. After thousands of years of change, transformation, setbacks, rapid advances, monstrous defeats, unevenness in human conflicts with nature and with other human beings, which was constantly changing in its character, the colossal units of production and exchange that have come to be known as the modern nation state came into being, ruled and fashioned by a class of people who resulted from this long and arduous path of dialectical development. The modern nation state was the creation of the modern bourgeoisie and serves as the political form or funnel through which this class continues to perpetuate itself in its quest for historical immortality. The most highly developed political formation of this type took place in Europe and later in North America. It is for those reasons that the brutality that has come to be a part of this class slashing its way across the planet has come to be associated with Europeans generally, rightfully so. Capitalism and the European predatory nation state became to Europe and the rest of the world what feudalism in its most advanced forms was to Asia, and communal and intricate pre-feudal modes, along with a variety of early forms of social production, were to the continent of Africa. The European bourgeoisie could become international precisely because they were national. After carving out and consolidating their sway within a certain geographical area which defined its borders, a given national state could continue its expansion. This occurs because of the organic and predatory nature of the capitalist mode of production. With this expansion, bourgeois rule spreads. It therefore became a highly developed system for international conquest, with its ruling class at the helm, guiding in a deliberate and calculating way its own realization and affirmation through continuous conquest. Anybody know what I just read? Anyway, this is unquote. This is Comrade Modibo Kadali. What Kadali has done here is to detail the obvious. Indeed, the modern nation state was the creation of the modern bourgeoisie, and indeed, it is predatory. However, and that's rather obvious. After all is said and done, we still do not know its origin, nor the historical basis for its emergence in Europe. In addition, we are misinformed by Kadali, who claims that the European bourgeoisie would become international precisely because they were national, unquote. In fact, the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois nation were products of imperialism, the international activity of slavery and colonialism. In other words, they didn't create themselves and the world, they attacked the world, and in this process became a creature of that imperial adventure. This is the point made by Hosea Jaffe in his book, A History of Africa, and we want to quote Jaffe here. Quote, the 15th century then saw the multiplication of the primary accumulation of European capitalism, and Africa played the most important part in the process as the principal arena of European colonialism, the very genesis and foundation of the capitalist system. From the turn of the 19th, like Kadali didn't tell us where the capitalist system came from. This is what Jaffe is doing. From the turn of the 16th century, the Americas and Asia were added to this foundation. And out of this totality, this foundation of Africa and African slavery and colonialism. And out of this totality arose capitalism and modern Europe itself. See, so it's through slavery, the foundation of slavery, of African slavery. Africa played the most important part in the process as the principal arena of European colonialism. The principal arena of European colonialism was Africa. And then from the turn of the 16th century, the Americas, these territories that we are in now in this building, and Asia were added to this foundation. And out of this totality arose capitalism and modern Europe itself. Europe did not create itself, like that. And before capitalist colonialism, there was no Europe, only a collection of feudal, mercantile, and tribal towns, farms, villages, discrete states and kingdoms vying and warring with each other, just as in Africa, but on a different property basis, that of private property in the land. Europe then was neither a concept nor a reality, at most a vague idea, but that Arabs, but not Europeans, had long ago in some place northwest of of Greece. As long as Europe remained isolated from the world, there was no Europe. When it became connected with and dependent on first Africa, then the Americas, and finally Asia, it began to become a reality and an idea. Only when Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Dutch, English, German, Danish, and Swedish confronted and clashed with Africa, America, and Asia did the need arise for them to consider themselves as a set, a whole, different from, hostile to, and eventually superior to Africans, what they call Americans, and Asians. Colonialism gave them a common interest, unquote. That makes, you can put a handle on that. You can understand that. This common interest, the sense of sameness, common history, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture, elements contained in most definition of the nation, was forged through slavery and colonialism. This was the nation-building process. The sense of sameness and common culture of violence are features of the subjective factors identifying the European nation. Okay? I mean, so there's nothing mysterious about this. There's really no mystery in this. It's through slavery, and Europe becomes defined and defines itself through the process of robbery, brigandage, slavery, colonialism, etc. This is what creates this entity that we call Europe and the white man. Contrary to white leftists and modern-day Marxists, both the white ruling class and the white working class owe their existence to this process. And this is to take the mystery out of the white workers class, because nobody can understand why the white workers joined the Klan, why the white workers are the ones who are on the forefront of the attacks on black people, etc. We say, contrary to white leftists and modern-day Marxists, both the white ruling class and the white working class owe their existence to this process. They are historical twins containing the same DNA and spawned by a history of genocide and enslavement of other peoples that is repugnant in its entirety. The parasitic capitalist economy is the objective factor, the material basis upon which the subjective relies. It is the bonding element of the nation that holds this collective community together. In other words, the subjective aspect of this, what we characterize as a nation, the subjective content is this sense of sameness. The subjective is what's in your brain, and the objective is what's in the world. You understand? And when you are most successful, what's in your brain reflects what's in the world. When what's in your brain does not reflect what's in the world, usually you end up in a straitjacket in rubber rooms. But the reality is that this sense of sameness, this white nationalist worldview is a subjective factor. This is one aspect of it, but that's not enough. We say the objective factor, we say the parasitic capitalist economy is the objective factor, the material base upon which the subjective relies. It is the bonding element of the nation that holds this collective community together. I hope we understand what's being said here. Because the objective, the economy of slavery, the economy of ripping all the resources from the rest of the world is what solidifies what's the subjective, this sense of sameness, this sense of superiority, this sense of being better than everybody else. It won't stand up by itself. What makes it stand up is an economy based on slavery that feeds all of them through stealing everything from the rest of the world. That is the objective factor that contributes to what we are identifying here as the European nation. All right? And this is why the consciousness of white people, you can see, is so affected when you see things happening with the economy, when you see things happening with other oppressed peoples around the world breaking free, because the whole definition of who white people are depends upon this relationship they got with Africans and other people who ain't nothing, because white people are everything. So now if I'm something, that challenges the definition of who they are. That's why I have to be an African, because if I'm not an African, who the hell are the white people? That's why they have to really struggle. That's why when I change my name, it's a real problem for them. I change my name. If who the hell am I? If you're an African, then how the hell can I be who I say I am? Do you understand? How can America be what I say it is if you are an African? These are profoundly important questions. And again, the ideological, this subjective identity relies upon this bond, this cement, this gorilla glue, if you will, not to be confused with monkeying with the economy. This gorilla glue of the economy is what holds this. This is what makes the sense of sameness work, which holds it together. Every time the black revolution gets strong, white people start growing afros. and dreadlocks and other manifestations of it. Excuse me. Is there any water in that? The European nation, and we do mean European. The European nation, and we do mean European, with this multiplicity of languages, classes, and internal borders, was born as a bourgeois nation, a white Christian nation, spawned through the blood and gore of slavery and colonialism, and resting on a foundation of capitalism benefiting Europe at the expense of Africans and the rest of the world. Let's go back. I didn't say the French nation or the German nation. I said the European nation. And we do mean European, with this multiplicity of languages, classes, and internal borders, was born as a bourgeois nation, a white Christian nation, spawned through the blood and gore of slavery and colonialism, and resting on a foundation of capitalism, benefiting Europe at the expense of Africans and the rest of the world. Aspects of the European nation's subjective content, its self-perception, were forged through the assault on Islam during the Christian crusades of the feudal era for control of much of the same territory in North Africa and the Middle East that imperialism is contending for today. However, the most essential component of Europe's subjective identification grew out of its history of genocidal aggression against Africa that included colonial slavery. Herein lies the process that bonded Europe into a single nation, though differentiated by sometimes competing capitalist centers designated as countries and incorrectly identified as nations. Not through language. Here lies the process that bonded Europe into a single nation, though differentiated sometimes by sometimes competing capitalist centers designated as countries and incorrectly identified as nations. Here we go, this Stalin thing about language and et cetera, et cetera. No, we say that the process, of slavery, colonialism, et cetera, is what bonded Europe into a single nation, though differentiated sometimes not by language, but by competing capitalist centers designated as countries and incorrectly identified as nations. This, like the anti-Islamic national component, is residual from the pre-colonial European feudal era, where contending European powers defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other, except for the united looting expedition through the Middle East that occurred under the religious banner of Christianity. And this was led by the Pope, by the way. This is, so he's been raping for a long time, the Catholic Church. This whole looting expedition, you heard of the Holy War, the Crusades. They glorified this in history and what have you, but it was a looting expedition through the same areas in the world that's being contested today in Northern Africa and what they call the Middle East. This is when Europe struck out and on this whole looting expedition. Thus, the European nation was born white and Christian. Moreover, it was born as a bourgeois nation, as the center of capitalist production stemming from parasitic accumulation of capital flowing from colonial slavery. Even the European working class was born on the pedestal of colonialism and slavery, therefore ultimately realizing the benefits of an oppressor nation and identifying with its own bourgeoisie. Feudalism preceded capitalism in Europe. Feudal society was defined primarily by the relationship between the nobility, impoverished peasants, and serfs, agricultural workers who were tied to the estates of the feudal lords, who expropriated most of what the serfs produced. While serfs could not be individually bought and sold, as was the case with Africans, the serfs had little or no rights that were not granted by the lords. The role of the feudal state was to protect this relationship that required permanent attachment of the serfs to the landed estates. This thing about serfdom, this period of feudalism in Europe, it has so much of that resides in language and things that we are familiar with today. Even the landlord. The landlord, that's from feudal Europe. That whole concept of the landlord, this is from feudalism. And so is the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It is from feudalism. This is from the feudal era that we are talking about. This stuff that's in the Bible that you read comes from feudal era of Europe. That's what we are talking about. That's where the lords came from, not from some extraterrestrial, yeah. And so, as we know, in describing the transformation of feudalism to capitalism, Karl Marx authored the term primitive accumulation, naming the European enslavement, genocide, wars and occupation of oppressed peoples around the world as the source of the vast wealth extraction out of which the entire capitalist system was born. This is where it comes from. Not through some genius of white people, not because God blessed America or some nonsense like that. It was slavery, rape, genocide, and pillage. This was the whole thing came from. This is where it came from. But Marx erroneously includes in his definition of primitive accumulation the internal process of European peasants and serfs being driven from the land through England's enclosure acts, beginning in the early 1600s, that privatized lands that had been collectively farmed by peasants for centuries. You've heard of the enclosure acts, and if you may not have paid attention because it was the most boring, stupid stuff when you went to school, because I remember the enclosure acts, and it's just something if you were, had a good memory, you might be able to take a test and say something about the enclosure acts, but it didn't really mean anything to us. But the enclosure acts, these were acts that were imposed on the peasantry and what have you in Europe, so that it pushed the peasants off the land, took the land, pushed the peasants off the land. But the thing that facilitated that, the thing that prompted that, was how the economy was in the process of transformation and changing because of the slave trade. And no longer were the peasants needed on the land. If your economy was going to be successful, they had to move beyond this process because the developing economy had run into its limitations under feudalism. this relationship between peasants trapped on the land. Because now what was needed was this whole new ruling class was emerging. And it was outside of this feudal process. And it needed to have workers who were free to go and sell the value of their labor power. Do you understand? That means they had to be off the land. And if somebody could live on the land, why the hell would they go work for somebody else? And that's one of the reasons that you lost everything you had. Because as long as you had the ability to feed, clothe, and house yourself, then you would not voluntarily go and feed, clothe, and house white people. You understand? And this is, the economy. This is what we're looking at. So we say, according to Marx from Part 8, Volume 1 of Capital, quote, the economic structure of capitalist society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The dissolution of the latter set free the elements of the former. The immediate producer, the laborer, could only dispose of his own person after he ceased to be attached to the soil and ceased to be the slave, serf, a bondsman of another, could only dispose of his own person. The immediate producer could only dispose of his own person after he had ceased to be attached to the soil. You can't dispose of your own person if you're a slave. If you're a slave, your own person is owned by somebody else. To have control of your own person, dispose of your own person, you cannot be a slave. That's the point that's being made here. But the French intellectuals have had such a profound influence on European intellectuals that they create this other language that can only be understood by them. To become a free seller of labor power who carries his commodity wherever he finds a market, he must further have escaped from the regimen of the guilds, the rules for apprentices and journeymen, and the impediments of their labor regulations. Hence, the historical movement which changes the producers into wage workers appears on the one hand as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this expropriation is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. And it's true. But it's not the annals of mankind, it's the annals of Europe. Because what he is talking about, this transformation that happened among white people, that could only have happened because of slavery and colonialism. Do you understand? It's slavery and colonialism that's changed the conditions in Europe, that forced them to push the peasants off of the land and into selling their labor power to the capitalist class. But all of this came about and could only have come about because of slavery and colonialism. This is what gave birth to this process that created both the bourgeoisie and the white working class. That's why this whole empathy with the white working class as white workers is nonsense. Yes. Because they still are the colonizer. They were created by this entire process. And this is why we say that for the white working class, the so-called white working class, to become a part of the rest of us, they have to abandon their place on this pedestal. They have to create what we call national suicide. Marx was wrong. Though this process involved the creation of the social mobility and capitalist labor force previously prohibited by feudalism, it is not primitive accumulation. European capitalist society may have very well grown out of the economic structure of feudal society, but it was conceived by way of, quote, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, unquote. So we say, Marx said that European capitalist society may have grown out of these other structures, but its conception, it was conceived by this process of rape and pillage of the rest of the world. Y'all with me on that? Yeah. Y'all know what conception is, don't you? Y'all know how you conceive something, don't you? Yeah. So notably, in Capital, Marx devotes far more pages to the conditions of peasants and serfs in the transformation from feudalism to capitalism than he does to the enslavement and genocide that created immense wealth for Europe but destroyed the lives and means of production for millions and millions of African and oppressed peoples for centuries to come. Equating the removal of the European peasants from their land with the fact that Europe transformed Africa into a quote-unquote warren for the commercial hunting of black skins is a historical lie. It relegates African people to mere footnotes in history. The expulsion of the peasants from the land is a result of the process of primitive accumulation of capital, not a part of it. Ultimately, the former serfs became European workers who now also sit on the pedestal of our oppression and benefit from it enormously. This ain't picking on the white workers. You understand? This is not some race nationalist politics, all the white people. This is not what we're doing now. We have to deconstruct this entire myth and this process and look at it scientifically, because what has passed as science up to now has been false. It's not been science. They've used scientific methods to come up to some really wrong conclusions. And you come up to wrong conclusions when you don't have all the facts that go into the equation. You can't get a right answer. Even if you're brilliant, the best you can do is come up with a brilliant wrong answer. You understand? This Eurocentric era by Marx subordinates the historical basis of the existence of Africans and others to the requirements for European development. So we don't exist. We don't exist except for how it is significant and how it contributes to the development of Europe and white people. That's our role. Do you understand? That's what's been, and white people are a minority of the people on the planet Earth, but the majority of the people on Earth exist for the purpose of thrusting them into existence. He said that we saw from Hosea Jaffe, and we will see from Marx that all of this stuff that he called the primitive accumulation that gave rise to capitalism, which is the same thing as white power, came through the enslavement and oppression, exploitation of everybody else on earth. That's extraordinary. What does it take for somebody even to be able to see themselves in that fashion? But that's the way Europe sees the world. And they can't help it until something takes down a tower in Twin Towers in Manhattan, begins to change their capacity for absolute and total self-centeredness. This Eurocentric era, we said, this political report is replete with examples that challenges Marx's confusion on this issue. When it comes to objectively describing the historical process that gave rise to capitalism and its impact on Europe and the development of capitalism, Hosea Jaffe, quoted earlier in this chapter, and the African People's Socialist Party do a better job. Marx's lack of clarity stems from his own social location on the pedestal of African slavery, a location that provided the superstructure for the European capitalist society within which Marx's consciousness was forged and that his life's work relentlessly criticized. So we're not saying that Marx was confused because he was a white man. You understand? It's not some racial, biological thing that we're talking. I don't want to even get trapped in them because he was a white man. Socialism is a white man's thing. And no, that's not what we're saying. Because we can take the science that was really refined and helped develop by Marx and Engels of looking and examining the world, materialism, historical materialism, dialectical historical materialism. We took the science that they worked on and proved their error. You understand? I don't know how many of you ever had this problem in school, but when I was in school and we used to do math problems and the teacher was constantly saying, well, okay, you got the answer, but I don't know how you did it. How did you get the answer? Because, I never could understand why they kept messing with how you got the answer. Because they're coming up with answers, but they're wrong because the method that they used was wrong. And they could not come up, or they used the method in the wrong way. And they could not, so you come up with an answer that appears to be correct, but that's why that was also important. That's also why I can't do math. That's not why I can't do math, because when I was in third grade, Miss Bennett embarrassed the hell out of me while I was up on the blackboard trying to work out math problem. And I've had serious problems. I've had problems since then, you know. I see math problems that make me want to throw up. I see math, and you know, but that's another story. In One People, One Party, One Destiny, the political reporter to our party's 5th Congress, we commented on the tendency by Marx to muddle this issue. Here's a selection where we said, quote, "We have to note here as well that Marx's description of slavery as a quote-unquote economic category and his concept of primitive accumulation provide outstanding examples of historic objectification of African people by Europeans. The entire historical process that resulted in the total disruption of the political economy of Africa, the imposition of colonial borders, and the capture and dispersal of millions of Africans whose forced labor was responsible for the development of Europe and European society is characterized as an economic category." Isn't that incredible? And taken all your life, all your history, all the dead people, all the people who were captured and brought across the Atlantic in these ships, we're an economic category. That's not how we were experiencing that. And the only way it can be experienced like that because this was important to them and their development. We have been objectified. We are objects of history and they are subjects of history. Do you understand? Marx reduces the process of European pillage and plunder of the world and the ensuing genocide and enslavement to quote-unquote primitive accumulation of capital, a footnote whose function in history is to explain the development of Europe. In other words, this is really profound because we find Africans and other people still trapped with this way of seeing the world, which is a European bourgeois imperialist way of seeing the world, even if it were articulated by Marx, who people refer to as the father of communism. In other words, Marx developed the concept of the fetish of the commodity to explain how commodity production for the market, obscures and mystifies the relationship between people, allowing it to be confused with the relationship between things. Do you know what this means, the fetish of the commodity? This is what Marx talked about because in the past, long time ago, in Europe and other places in the world, people went to the market to make exchange. A person would take a cow and exchange it for, for these tables that somebody else made. They met at the market, and people, had this kind of economic interchange. But with commodity production, which is production for the market and not for individuals, is you produce this for the market, for sale. That's the only thing the production is for. When commodity production prevails, then what happens is that you don't necessarily see the person who made the table anymore. You go to the store. And instead of trading the table for the cow, you just take this substitute for value that's called money, right? And you buy the table from the store. And that disguises the relationship that you have with the person who made the table, when actually there's a relationship between people that has now been mystified. That's where he comes up with the fetish of the commodity. Do you understand? Y'all with me on that? Yeah. So they've liquidated or obscured this relationship that exists between people. That's a person who traded value with another person, but you don't see that person anymore because of the commodity. So we say that here, and now we talk about primitive accumulation, say here the relationship between peoples and countries is also obscured and mystified. Marx attributes European development solely on the quote-unquote genius and productive forces inside of Europe. He is thereby covering over or liquidating the origin of such development in the parasitic impairment of the capacity of independent development in Africa and other places victimized by Europe. See, cows do exist. Do you know that, right? You know there is a cow someplace. Y'all know that, right? Y'all know that's where milk comes from? Yeah. and not from the grocery store, from the supermarket. Milk comes from a damn cow. I don't care how much people might want to confuse that issue for you. You understand? Milk comes from the cow, unless it's soy or almond milk. But the point is it gets mystified here. And just like the value of our labor is now mystified because they want to talk to us about value coming from the point of production. They're saying that profit comes from the point of production. Exploitation comes from the point of production. It is true that the white worker is exploited perhaps at the point of production. But what they don't say is how did the process, the resources get to the point of production? Where did the aluminum come from except bauxite from the mines in Guinea or Conakry or some other place like that? You see what I'm saying? So all of that gets liquidated. And also it gets liquidated that the white people can go to work because there's an African slave someplace working at what they call minimum wages, which is the advance in pay that Africans have got since slavery, right? So since slavery, for the last couple of hundred years, you've got a pay raise of $7 and something an hour. I am so proud of that. You understand? That's what I've been working for all my damn life. So the European nation became the means of securing the loyalty of the emancipated laborers to the emergent capitalist state and by association ruling class. Now it is not the feudal state or sheriff of Nottingham that forces the toilers to fight the wars of the ruling class or put the interests of the state above their own. It is the flag, the national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, along with the collective identification with a common history that transcends individual European countries or territories. This is what facilitates the new relations of production necessary for capitalist production. Relations of production resting on a parasitic economic foundation whose genesis is colonial slavery. So they don't have to come. They don't have to go and make you do that. People are turning their own children to the police now because of this patriotism, this identity with their own bourgeoisie, the colonial state. Now, they pledge allegiance, and people, and especially Africans who colonize Africans, we are more loyal to the colonial state than the white people are. We throw our body on the grenades faster than the white people throw their bodies on the grenades. We become good Americans, and the rest of that, and that's the basis of the rise of the nation, because now the mode of production has changed from feudalism to capitalism, and now the toilers have been freed from the domination of the sheriff of Nottingham and the feudal state that rounded people up and made them go fight the Crusades and do other kinds of stuff. People now don't have to be rounded up. In fact, they fight for the right to go kill and die for the state. That's nationalism. That's why the nation was necessary. That's why the nation became necessary. In summation, the European nation derives from relations of production contained within capitalism that was spawned by slavery and colonialism. It was born as a parasitic capitalist or bourgeois nation that encompasses all classes within it. The European sense of sameness, self-perception, and subjective expression necessary for binding the emergent working class to its newly forged bourgeoisie is white and Christian. The material base of the European nation is the parasitic capitalist system that bore it in Europe. The capitalist system feeds the entire European nation through its cannibalistic, parasitic relationship to Africa and most of the world. You'll see that there's some contending things here at work. And if you don't understand this dialectic, you will not understand anything. But this is what achieves the loyalty of the white people to the system. That this fact that the rape and pillage, the stuff that brings resources to white communities all around the world. Sometimes these communities are called countries and sometimes they're called nations, but all the wealth that is accrued there comes as a consequence of what they continue to do to Africa, Asia, what they call Latin America or South America. That's why you have all those wars being fought by Europe and white power centered in all these places. And the other promises of war are with forces that can compete with them or might compete with them in the process of getting these resources that they get from Africa, Asia, and South America. We have belabored this discussion and description of the European nation because its arrival on the world historical scene with the advent of capitalism has determined through the barrel of a gun how other national expressions would be defined by other peoples in various parts of the world. It is no accident that Europe would describe the nation in a manner that would not be applicable to Africans, the indigenous of the Americas, and many others whose enslavement was a condition for the emergence of the European or white nation in the first place. European scholars have demanded a common definition of the nation. It is a declaration of European universalism that requires every nation to contain the same elements apparent in the European nation. It is an extraordinary example of philosophical metaphysics to suggest that we should determine the quality of any social phenomenon without first examining the specifics and history of the phenomenon being defined. It is an extraordinary example of imperialist national narcissism to define the validity of all social phenomena based on proximities of one's own reality. The function of the European nation was to serve the development of Europe alone. The function of the European nation was to serve the development of Europe alone. The function of the European nation was to serve the development of Europe alone. The rise of the European nation is an attack on the development and survival of much of the world. Our discussion of the African nation and its definition resting on a real material basis must serve African development. The research and writings of Cheikh Anta Diop demonstrate quite scientifically the cultural unity of Africa going back through millennia. Diop authored the book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, The Domains of Patriarchy and Matriarchy in Classical Antiquity, that today remains the standard for investigation of ancient Africa by serious historians. Below, we examine a quote extracted from Diop's otherwise deeply scientific work. Here, he not only expresses the spiritual aspect of African identity, but he also compares it to that of Europe. This is because the discussion of characteristics specific to national identity always distinguishes one people or nation from an other, right? You know you can't have a definition of a nation in isolation. We'll say more. The nation cannot be defined by measuring itself against itself, right? If there is no other, there is no logic for the nation. The white man needed the existence of the black man to achieve his identity. So it is with nations. See, you couldn't have a white man if everybody was white. You understand? There would be no such thing as a white man. Everybody's white. There is no white man. Right? Of course, the problem for the European nation is that it resulted from a false, self-serving European definition of the African. That's the problem. That's a fundamental problem that it has. Since this false definition was the basis upon which the sense of white sameness necessary for the definition of the European nation is anchored, the ability of the African to successfully achieve self-definition marks the beginning of the end of a crucial subjective factor necessary for European national coherence. Well, Diop's work placed significance in what he characterized as the southern or meridian meridional cradle of human development versus the northern cradle, and how the difference in material conditions peculiar to each of them contributed to shaping the worldview and character of their respective inhabitants. This is Diop's summation that contributes to defining the national character of African people as compared to Europeans. Quoting Diop now. In conclusion, the meridional cradle confined to the African continent in particular is characterized by the matriarchal family, the creation of the territorial state in contrast to the Aryan city-state, the emancipation of women in domestic life, xenophilia, cosmopolitanism, a sort of social collectivism, having as a corollary a tranquility going as far as unconcern for tomorrow, a material solidarity of right for each individual which makes moral or material misery unknown to the present day. There are people living in poverty, but no one feels alone, and no one is in distress. In the moral domain, it shows an ideal of peace, of justice, of goodness, and an optimism which eliminates all notions of guilt or original sin in religious and metaphysical institutions. This is really what Africans are often criticized for, by the way. Even today, there are remnants of what he's talking about in Africa, in our own communities, for which we are criticized. Matriarchy, for example. There's this guy, I can't think of his name, I can see his face, who wrote this piece in the 1960s that says the problem with Africans is the matriarchal family. And then they talked about how a problem, I can't think of this guy's name, Monahan. And then they talked about a problem with Africans is that we can't advance because we think of the collective instead of the individual. And individualism is the driving force from their perspective that creates productivity, etc., because every individual is scrambling to be everything. And Africans move and think collectively. And this is what I see all the time in St. Louis, when we're not shooting each other, and even when we shoot each other. But there is this sense of collectivism that characterizes the African and who we are as a people. And this is what we hear criticisms of all the time, don't we? We hear from our own communities, we hear what's wrong with us because we used to be like this, and we used to think like this, and we used to do stuff together, and now everybody's going crazy. In other words, everybody's acting like white people. But individualism, that is a particularly European and white thing that they would impose on the rest of us. The northern cradle, this is back to Diop, confined to Greece and Rome, is characterized by patriarchal family, by the city-state. It is easily seen that it is on contact with the southern world that the northerners broaden their conception of the state, elevating themselves to the idea of a territorial state and of an empire. The particular character of these city-states, outside of which a man was an outlaw, developed an internal patriotism, as well as xenophobia, individualism, moral and material solitude, a disgust for existence. Y'all know what I'm talking about? This is a white thing. A disgust for existence, all the subject matter of modern literature, which even in its philosophical aspect is none other than the expressions of the tragedy of a way of life going back to the Aryans' ancestors, all are attributes of this cradle, an ideal of war, violence, crime, and conquest inherited from nomadic life, with as a consequence a feeling of guilt and of original sin, which causes pessimistic, religious, or metaphysical systems to be built, is the special attribute of this cradle. That's of the white thing that he's talking about now, that we are all familiar with. And that's one of the distinguishing factors, distinguishing content of the African personality, African culture, African nation versus the Europe, unquote. However, notwithstanding the usefulness of the works of Diop and similar scholars, all of which had to battle against hundreds of years of European prejudice disguised as scholarship to reach the light of day, our discussion of the African nation will revolve around the same time period to which the birth of the European nation belongs. It is clear from what has already been revealed in this political report that there is a direct causal relationship between the existence of the European nation and the aspirations of Africans to consolidate the African nation. Like the European nation, the emergent African nation is a response to necessity. We are facing the historical requirements for advancing and developing Africa and African people, whose generally oppressive conditions of existence derive from the stuff resulting in the emergence of the European or white bourgeois or capitalist nation. One people, one party, one destiny address this necessity. It raises the issue of the consolidation of the African nation as a practical political problem that we must solve to forward the national liberation of our people from imperialist domination worldwide. Let me say this again, because we say that it raises the issue of the consolidation of the African nation as a practical political problem that we must solve to forward the national liberation of our people from imperialist domination worldwide. African internationalism is a theory of practice as exemplified by this passage, and I quote now, and I'm quoting from One People, One Party, One Destiny, which is the political report to the 5th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. Quote, an African internationalist investigation leads us to conclude, among other things, that key to the liberation of African people is the defeat of the parasitic stranglehold that has been imposed on us by imperialism. Moreover, as African internationalists, we recognize that Africa has been under some kind of attack for millennia, but that our struggle today is contextualized by the fact that the world economy that gives life to our oppression is a capitalist economy. In other words, this is not a fight against the Arabs. Which is not to say that there are not contradictions there. Our struggle is not fueled by a subjective need for vengeance against every group that has historically attacked Africa. This means that the struggle must be waged against the capitalist social system that is the basis of our exploitation and wretched conditions of existence today. Our struggle for the unification and emancipation of our Africa and our people is also a struggle against capitalism. Hence, our struggle, if it is to be fought to its successful conclusion, must be led by the African working class. It must result in the establishment of a unified Africa, a socialist Africa, responsive to the needs of African people worldwide. African internationalism teaches us that slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, along with African disunification and dispersal, provided the material basis for the European bourgeois national consolidation, the sense of white sameness resting on the pedestal of the oppression of African and colonized peoples. Hence, we understand that a key function of the revolutionary struggle for the permanent defeat of imperialism and to liberate Africa and her scattered children is the reunification of African people worldwide into a revolutionary proletarian nation. Quote, it is slavery that gave the colonists their value. It is the colonists that created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry, unquote. These words by Marx recognize the role of the plunder of Africa in the establishment of capitalism and carry with them the suggestion of what it will take to destroy the capitalist world economy. The African who gave value to the colonies is now the oppressed and exploited inhabitant of the colonies that are sometimes incorrectly referred to as nations. Our conditions of existence in the so-called colonies and elsewhere in this world of imperialist created borders are centered in and derived from the conditions of existence in Africa and are the consequence of the primitive accumulation of capital, the original sin. I want to read that again. Our conditions of existence in the colonies and elsewhere in the world of imperialist created borders are centered in and derived from the conditions of existence in Africa that are the consequences of the primitive accumulation of capital, the original sin. In other words, the hell we catch in North St. Louis, in Houston, Texas, in Accra, Ghana, in Haiti, the hell we catch all owe their existence to the initial original attack on Africa that resulted in the rise of European imperialism at our expense. That's the hell we catch. That's why those people who talk about, well, we just got to take care of ourselves here and don't worry about the Africans there, miss the point completely. Everything problem that we have here has its origin in the attack on Africa. The conditions of black people on the planet Earth everywhere, even in Australia and places like that, have their basis today in the attack on Africa, the conditions that has been imposed on Africa. Our revolutionary struggle for liberation, unification, and socialism in Africa throughout the colonies and other areas of the world to which we have been forcibly dispersed in the construction of capitalism will prove to be as significant in the defeat of the capitalist social system as the slave trade was in its advent. The socialist liberation and unification of Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class will be the central factor in the defeat of world capitalism and will provide the material basis for the advent of world socialism. African internationalism, which demands the total revolutionary liberation and unification of Africa and African people worldwide under the leadership of the African working class, is informed by this scientifically sound dialectic. Hence, the African internationalist struggle for the liberation and unification of Africa and African people is at the same time the key factor in the achievement of socialism as a world economy. It is the way forward for those Marxists and other socialists who are confronted with the false conundrum surrounding the question of socialism in one country. As capitalism was born as a world economy, with its basis in the enslavement and dispersal of African people, leading to, as Marx wrote, considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of producers, so too will socialism be born as a world economy in the process of reversing the verdict of imperialism. Hence, socialism will not be born in one country, but in many countries that are tied to the defining economy, a liberated and united Africa and people under the revolutionary leadership of the African working class. This is why a fundamental task of the African Revolution is the consolidation of the proletarian African nation. Uhuru. Uhuru. Yeah.
From the audience and the online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's on with us via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate the engagement of this live stream. Because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you. And make sure that the chairman sees your question. We'll go ahead and open it up now for questions and answers. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, comrade.
Yeah, I want to thank you for this discussion, this reading. This is powerful, and like you say, this is not some abstract question. And I appreciate the science that you bring to this question, and that's really what I want to address. You know, you said that talking about Europeans, white people, that they didn't create themselves and then attack the world. They attacked the world, then created themselves. And I thought that was critical. You know, and on this question of the nation, you have people with all kind of arguments. They'll say stuff like, we're all human. You know, they think that the question is what country you belong to, you French, English, you know, Ghanaian. Some people reject the whole notion. They say it's European, this concept of the nation. We're a cultural nation. Some people look to the Bible to define us. They call ourselves us African Americans because we live in this country and we weren't born in Africa. They say we're native to America, we're Moors, we're Jews, because of what happened during this period of history or that period of history. Some people refer to Arabs as the primary, you know, as our oppressors as well. They bring that into the discussion. But I really wanted you to just kind of, it's a whole discussion itself, but talk a little bit about the methodology of dialectical materialism, if I'm characterizing it right, that informs this whole question of the nation.
Yeah, I think that's really important because part of what we do and try to do, and I think we've done all along the line in this discussion, is not simply to state our views of something, but to also try and demonstrate how we came to the conclusion that we've come to. We all through this, that's what we do. We don't just say this is the truth. We don't say that this is some kind of religion and that faith is all it takes, for you. We try to expose to you how we came to these conclusions. And when we talk about the science of dialectical and historical materialism, we're talking about the method used to investigate phenomenon and then to analyze it. And that means that what we want to do is to see the world exactly as it is. Let's come to this question without preconceived notions of reality. Examine the world exactly as it is, and that sometimes is very difficult. And we know that from our own personal relationships and stuff, because we sometimes get trapped in relationships that we want to believe is true. We want to believe something is true, despite all the evidence that we see around us that this guy don't like me. Yes, this person don't. If you really love me, you wouldn't do these things you do. And we look at, it's really important to be able to discern what is the objective truth. It's not a matter, it requires us also, when we look at a contradiction, to look at the history of the contradiction. And we don't see all conditions, all events in history as necessarily the same. There's no denying, for example, that the aggression by Arabs in Africa and the enslavement of Africa, it lasted 1,500 years, longer, 3 times longer than the transatlantic slave trade. And slavery is not nice. It doesn't matter who the hell does it. It's not nice. But once you recognize that, you also see that a social system came into existence with slavery that dominates the whole world. It wasn't a European system. It wasn't an American system. It was a world economy that was created off the enslavement of Africans and the oppression and exploitation of vast humanity. So the question then is before us. Can we liberate the black people of the world by having a fight with the Arabs? That's a simple question. And of course the answer is no, you cannot do that. The dominating world economy is an imperialist white nationalist economy at this point, even though the white nationalist economy, world economy is in trouble. And they have contenders coming from China and other places of this whole world economy. But at this point, the dominant world economy, and even if it's a Chinese-dominated economy, it's still an imperialist capitalist economy that we have to fight our way out of. You're wasting your time picking a fight with Arabs based on what they did a long time ago, because we got to solve the problem that we are confronted with as a whole people around the world, and that embraces all the other rest of humanity, including Arabs. And so that's part of what we're talking about. But in terms of the overall question that Comrade Tacharo just raised, I think we went through that up to now with this discussion of the nation. I think we will say more and more about that moving forward, because it's a really complex and comprehensive discussion that's required, for what he just said. But this whole notion of how we conclude who we are, and this is not peculiar to the African People's Socialist Party. What the African People's Socialist Party has done is to assume the responsibility for defining our reality as a people in a scientific way, that the consequences of which will be to advance the liberation of African people. That's the basis of it. We don't say, okay, I want to be a Moor, I want to be a Jew, or because that happened a long time ago, the original Jews were black people. So what? You understand? What the hell does that mean? I've gone to, I think it was in North Carolina, South Carolina, went to these places where Africans are in a Yoruba, what they call a Yoruba village, living in mud huts and stuff like that. And because, listen, what you've done is insult Africa with the assumption that Africa would still be living in some kind of damn huts if white people had invaded and dominated us. So what? So if we lived in huts, then so what? You know, we have to create an entirely different kind of world. And who we are, and when we have this discussion, it is a discussion that reflects the needs of our people. It's not just some empty, let's have a discussion on this. Does Santa Claus exist? I mean, I've seen this discussion, was Jesus really a black person? And this becomes the dominant question. I don't care. I don't care. I really don't care. The question we are confronted with is the power construct of the whole world and how it traps us in it right now, and how can we define how we got here and what it's going to take to get us out of here. That's the fundamental question we are confronted with, and that's what we are trying to address. And we use a scientific process to do this because we got big time problems to solve, and I don't know how you solve the problem by becoming a Jew. I don't know how you solve the problem, you know, by saying the Arabs are the problem. How do you solve? What does that take us? Because Marx said something that was really important, that philosophers have generally explained the world. The problem is to change the world. And if your explanation of the world does not offer a suggestion of how to change the world, it's as worthless, useless as used toilet paper. Uhuru.
Chairman. I really appreciate the study and the political report, your leadership, and you know, really how African internationalism just cut through the fluff of everything and just really get to the fundamental questions of what we got to do and how to move forward. Something that really stood out that I wanted, it was like really two different questions, but could you say more about like how this process or the fetish of commodities, you know, obscures the relationship between people, and also like we talk a lot about like how during feudalism, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and how Marx explains primitive accumulation, but how you know, during that period before the attack on Africa, like what was the mode of production for Africa and most people in the world? Uhuru.
I don't know how competent I am to speak of the mode of production, because we carry on this discussion from, generally speaking, from the standpoint, again, of what has been introduced to us as modes of production. What Marx and Marxists have referred to as primitive communism or communalism, which presupposes the shared collective production and distribution of resources, and which presupposes an entirely different kind of society and outlook in a society. That the Marxists called it primitive, and they talked about, they used this Marxist concept of human development. They didn't say European development, of human development. Again, when they said human, they meant European. But the Marxist concept of human development starts humanity at this place that they refer to as primitive communism or primitive accumulation. Of communism, right? And this is, again, where people produced and shared everything in common. And that created an entirely different world outlook. This is the one that, if you're old enough and live in this country, and if you live in parts of Africa where the conditions have not been made so grotesquely bad that we've had to move away from the way we've done things in the past. If the capital has not penetrated in such a definitive way, we have this thing where even black people in this country refer to as brothers and sisters. We're brothers and sisters, etc. It is a whole different way of seeing the world and understanding the world when people produce collectively and share collectively. There's no basis for exploitation. There were all kinds of differences, you know, the oppression, exploitation of women, matriarchy, you know, it's deep and profound. So what there seems to have been what they refer to as primitive communism or primitive accumulation. Now, using the Marxist way of looking at the development of human society as they characterize it, from this primitive communism where everybody was equal, where women were not oppressed and exploited, then something happens to change that, to change this mode of production. This was how people produced collectively and shared collectively. And the thing that they said happened was that our primary contradictions in society were was with nature. You know, trying to feed, clothe, and house ourselves, but we were contending mostly with nature, not with each other, right? And so at some juncture, as a consequence of this process, according to the Marxists, then we became efficient enough, human society, that there emerged a surplus, more than what was needed by the community. And this created a profound contradiction according to the Marxists, because now the question has to be solved of, now that we have the surplus, who controls the surplus? Which gives rise for the advent of slavery in human society, they say. And so the ones who control the surplus dominates the whole society, and everybody's enslaved by the force that controls the surplus. And then from this, of course, slavery is a very difficult mode of production to maintain, because there is no incentive for somebody who is enslaved to produce, because this doesn't get anything for it. In fact, there's an incentive to rebel, to break tools, to poison the slave master, to rise up, and all of this stuff. And it becomes like, for various reasons, it's not a viable thing. And so, according to the Marxists, then the mode of production changes from slavery, where the slave master gets everything and everybody is owned and worked for the slave master, to feudalism, where now you can get a little bit, right? You're just tied to the land, you're not owned, etc. So this process, and then from feudalism, the Marxists have to contrive the way in which you get from feudalism, where everybody's trapped on the land, and the feudal masters, lords and what have you, own the land, and by virtue of owning the land, control the people, and the ones who work, peasants and serfs who work on the land, work mostly for the landlord, but they have to find a way for this development that they talked about to lead now to capitalism, because capitalism is supposed to be the next highest mode of production on this stair step, this process of development. And so they can't find it inside the feudal production. They step outside of feudal production and come up with this concept called primitive accumulation of capital. When they come up with primitive accumulation of capital, they really don't have to step outside of feudal production. It's still a white thing. It's still a European thing. And so this thing that they call primitive accumulation of capital, which is slavery, which is the attack on China and other peoples around the world, that brings in value, that changes the social system, it is part of how they objectify the rest of us, because they are still the subjects of history. Do you see? They're still the subjects of history. So what happens to us is significant only as it contributes to or takes from the development of white people, white power, Europe as it's characterized. So this is the process that they have used. And that's that has helped to define what we look at in terms of modes of production. But the fact is that you cannot find in Europe this thing that they call, except if you do, it's in rare, isolated occasions where there was no oppression, there was no exploitation, and everybody shared everything, except in rare, isolated circumstances. But this was something that was common to Africa and to other places around the world, and they call it primitive accumulation, primitive communism, or primitive communalism. Let me just say this, what I think is really interesting, because, so this is primitive communism, or primitive accumulation, primitive, not of communalism. But when you keep going through this stair step that I've just talked about of development, so after capitalism, a certain development of capitalism, which is happening in Europe, because they refer to us as the uncivilized people and stuff like that. After development reaches a certain place, optimal place in Europe, then we develop to what? Communism. So it was primitive when it was us. You understand? It was primitive when it was us. Now it becomes the real McCoy after a certain kind of development happens in Europe. I think this is really important kind of discussion. All of this is important because we've been trapped with definitions of reality that were created to serve the development and interests of Europe essentially, and that's because Europe has dominated the world for the last 500 years or so, and the last 500 years of history has been an imperialist history, and now we are struggling to define our own reality, and that's why we are challenging these concepts that's been put forth us, and that's why we say African internationalism is an ever-developing theory. It's an ever-developing theory. And it's not just a theory of black people, it's a theory it talks about the whole world, but it's not just a theory in the abstract, it's a theory of what? Practice. A theory of practice. That's why we say that just to explain the world isn't worth anything. Changing the world is the critical question, and if you don't have an explanation that would change the world, if making you a Jew doesn't help us to change the world, if making the Arabs the primary contradiction doesn't help us to change the world, if being Moors don't help us to change the world, then the explanation of the world is absolutely useless. Uhuru. I know it was a long-winded kind of response, but Uhuru.
Uhuru, we have a question from, please bear with me, I hope I don't mess up his name. It's Menace Ajaku. Mensa, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. He asks, would it be said that the building of a nation is indoctrinated its people based upon demographic to push particle agenda? You want me to read it up? I'm sorry, I messed it all up.
Go ahead.
Okay. Would it be said that the building of a nation is to indoctrinate its people based upon demographic to push particular agenda, to push a particular agenda?
I don't think that's the case. I think that I think that the development of the European nation spoke to historical necessity. And by that, I mean that the development of Europe had reached a certain place under feudalism, and that for this development to move forward, something else had to happen in that society. And what happened in that society is that a group of Europeans, sectors of the European population struck out from Europe and began to engage in things like like plunder, like people like Christopher Columbus and others whose names we were taught in school when we were growing up. They began to plunder the world. And in plundering the world, they began to get resources that challenged the existing social system, that feudalism couldn't work. If this other process of development was going to occur, there's no way in hell capitalism could have emerged under feudal relations of production. There's no way in hell that the capitalism could happen, because now all of the people who would be workers are tied to the land and they can't go no place, and that development would not have occurred. So we're saying that it spoke to a kind of situational historical necessity. And so it wasn't like a plan, let us go plan to build a nation. We saw instances like in Italy and other places where white people have concluded that they would create what they call a nation. That was happening in Italy. We have Italy, now we must create Italians. We had a situation where in the 19th century, 18th or 19th century, I can't remember which, that Cecil Rhodes, 19th century, I think, declared that if England is going to survive, it's going to have to become imperialist. And he struck out and went to Africa and attacked Africa and South Africa. You know, we've seen the consequences and still experiencing the consequences of what Cecil Rhodes did then. That's why people want to act like history is dead. That was a long time ago. This is nonsense. We're still fighting that. That's why people want to say, well, we are a nation because we've been here a long time. We ain't never stopped fighting since we've been. Never, never, never stopped fighting since we've been here. Only the sellouts, only those people who have been actually brought into the system created by white people have not fought. Historically, we've fought, and that's been all over the world. So it's an ongoing process of resistance that has occurred. So I don't think it's a matter, nations, of being created because somebody planned to create the nation. I think that historical necessity demands at this critical moment in history that there is no future for Africans trapped in this situation that white power, white people have locked us in for centuries today, whether that is as Haitians or Jamaicans or as black Americans and what, we have no future. And history demands it. Historical necessity demands the consolidation of the African nation and the recapture of all the resources, because Europe is stealing and China and everybody is stealing everything because there is no consolidated African nationality and African nation state to speak to the interests and capture the resources of Africa and protect and provide for African people all around the world. And this is the process that's going to lead to the liquidation and overturn of capitalism as a social system and the emergence of a new kind of social system where the minority population, the barbarians who have been in power since the advent of slavery, will be tossed out on their asses, and we can have a quality future. That's what it's about. And that's one of the reasons why even white workers and everybody fight tooth and nail. Africa is supposed to be so bad, but we had to have bombs and shootings and everything else to get them to act like they're going to leave. They trick us in saying Africa's so bad you don't want to be here, you hate Africa, and you got to shoot them out of Africa to get them to leave Africa and what have you. So I think that the nation question is not something that has come as a consequence of some conspiracy, but it has come as a consequence of this group trying to speak to necessity as it imposed itself on them for their own development as it was occurring, trying to occur. Uhuru.
Uhuru. We have another question from David in Pittsburgh. Petersburg, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Wants to know what distinguishes African internationalism in its defining of the African nation from Pan-African.
I don't think Pan-Africanism defines the African nation. I think this is one of the criticism that we have of much of what we refer to around this discussion of the nation, because I can't find the definition of the African nation coming from Pan-Africanism. And though you can find that people who fought against Garvey, the Communist Party in the 1920s, the George Patmore, who wrote the book Pan-Africanism or Communism, who has become sort of a Pan-Africanist icon, fought against Garvey. And what is really interesting is that even those people who were fighting against Garvey and his concept, his work to consolidate or unite the African nation, they were opposing Garvey's understanding of African being a single nation of people but describing the reality of African people in a fashion that you can't say that Africans are anything but a nation. In fact, they talked about the condition of black people all around the world stemming from the same process and being looking just alike, but we're not a nation. We're white people and disguised as something else. Chocolate-covered white workers or something like that.
Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, come in.
I really want to thank you for this political report and this chapter. It's extremely important. Hold on, let me get my glasses. I was trying to be cute, but I can't be. Okay. All right, so my question is, Chairman, the party has led the way in the ideological war for one Africa, one nation. It was the vanguard of the African working class that demanded the end of these colonial borders. There's forces like Julius Malema are now making these constant statements that Africa must unite, and in his words, as a United States of Africa. And, there's videos and interviews like this that are becoming more and more popular. And can you say, Chairman, the difference between the African People's Socialist Party's One Africa, One Nation, and other forces, One Africa, One Nation?
I can't speak to other forces in general, but one thing that is becoming increasingly clear, even to the African lickspill militant neo-colonial sellout forces, is that it doesn't work. And that masses of people are striking out and trying to win our freedom, and that what they have constructed just doesn't work. It's unviable. It's unviable in South Africa. It's unviable in Sudan. It's unviable in Haiti. It's unviable everywhere. So there has always been a sector of the African petty bourgeoisie from time to time that will talk about the United Africa. We must have a United Africa, United States of Africa, or something to that effect. But even that doesn't get to the question. The question is United Africa, Africa united under the leadership of what social force? And when Malema says that the capitalist system has to be overturned, and I don't remember seeing him say that, the capitalist system has to be overturned and the African working class must ascend to the leadership, must become the new ruling class, then he will have become an African internationalist. And he hasn't been able to do that. That's what we say. It's not good enough to say just that Africa must unite. Every neo-colonial puppet in the world says that, can say it. And in fact, Hillary Clinton has even said that at one point. The fact Africa must unite, and it must unite under the leadership of the African working class. Capitalism, imperialism must be overturned, and all the borders separating Africans from each other and from our resources must be destroyed. That's what has to happen. And it's not even good enough just to talk about occupying land in South Africa. All the land in South Africa belongs to African people, everything. So I mean, we're not fighting to become squatters on our own land. We're fighting to get the squatters off our land, to take the control of all our resources. That's what this is about. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be absolutely clear. Ideologically sharp, clear on what it is that we stand for and what it is that we're fighting for. Uhuru.
Uhuru, we got a question from Egon in Tampa, Florida, wants to know regarding the U.S. policy of classifying whites as Europeans, Middle Easterns, and North Africans for expansion and land appropriations. How do you suggest we deal with the census?
The census? Well, first of all, let me just say that what's really important is for African to have power. There is no substitute for Africans having our own power under the leadership of the African working class. Nothing else works. Everything that they create and define is for their interests, not for our interests. That's the first thing, which is not to say that we don't live in this world and that we don't have to find ways to take advantage of contradictions that as they exist in this world, because we do that. I mean, even Black Power Blueprint is something that we do, recognizing the world that we live in and trying to build a greater platform from which we can struggle to take over everything that is important to African life and overturning a social system. So that's the critical thing, because, you know, I mean, they've interjected this thing of mixed race people and stuff like that. I've lived during a time where, what was it, an eighth of a percentage of African blood made you black? And now they've created the mixed race. And the reason they created mixed race, because blackness is creeping up on everything, and there's an attempt that's being made to nullify, obscure the struggle and power of African people by creating whole new races, new groups of people. And the whole race concept is fallacious anyway. If you're trapped in that, you got a big trouble. That's what we're saying now. We're struggling for national liberation, not racial liberation. National liberation. We define what the nation is ourselves, and it meets our own needs and requirements. So the thing is that they will do that, they will define that, and they will always do that as long as they have the power and ability to do that. It's our responsibility to take over more and more of our life and to push the ability of white power to encroach on any aspect of our existence. Uhuru. And there's not much time to go beyond that. There's something else before, because I know we're right close to the deadline. That's why I was so expeditious and perhaps trying to respond to that.
Uhuru, this
I see here from Mensa Ajanaku also quotes one of Fred Hampton's great sayings. He just says, I am the proletariat, I am not the pig. You're going to have to keep on saying it. I am the proletariat, I am not the pig. You understand?
Uhuru, this study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysts, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows and music by Africans all around the world. Tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you learned today and what you heard today and what you learned more, and you want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. The 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party will be October 6th through 12th here in St. Louis, Missouri, and its theme Vanguard, the advanced detachment of the African Revolution. A part of this historical event will be the Black Power Masquerade Ball, with live culture performance, dancing, best dress contest, and silence auction. All information around the Congress and banquet can be found at apspcongress.org. Register today and hashtag VanguardUp. Join in the Freedom Mass Choir. The Freedom Mass Choir is an all-African community choir that sings songs of resistance and revolution. The choir will also be performed at the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Parties. Members are located throughout the United States and attend weekly rehearsals, both in person and via live stream and video. Sign up by emailing blackpowerchoir@gmail.com or call 727-537-6736. On October 3rd and 4th, the Black is Black Coalition for Social Justice and Peace and Reparations will be conducting its annual march, rally, and conference in Washington, D.C. This march is appropriately themed, There is No Peace, Africa and Africans are at war, U.S. to the world. Comply or die. More information about this event can be found at blackisbackcoalition.org. December 9th through 16th, come cruise with us aboard the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, a time for revolutionaries to kick back and relax. You will be on board with Chairman Omalu Yesatella, while getting to enjoy the spoils of the ship. Destinations include Grand Cayman, Mahogany Bay, Belize, and Cozumel, Mexico. Get signed up today at uhurulegacycruise.org. The cruise also serves as a fundraiser for the African Socialist International. Uhuru.
Vanguard up.